Tear up her badge, Richard Sterling said without even looking at the woman standing across the polished boardroom table. The command sliced through the room. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward Naomi Carter as a security supervisor hesitated for a heartbeat before reaching for the plain visitor badge clipped to her blazer. Richard stepped forward himself, ripped it in half with slow, deliberate force, and let the pieces fall onto the black marble floor. "People like you do not belong in meetings that move billions of dollars," he said. A few executives smiled behind expensive coffee cups. Others stared at their tablets, pretending not to watch. Naomi never flinched. She simply looked down at the torn plastic resting beside her polished shoes. The conference room overlooked Manhattan through floor-to-ceiling glass, where gray clouds rolled over the skyline and flashes of afternoon sunlight reflected across neighboring towers. Inside, the air smelled of fresh espresso, leather, and warm electronics humming beneath the enormous presentation screens. Richard straightened his tailored charcoal jacket and turned back toward the waiting investors. "No," he said calmly. "Let us continue with people who actually belong here." Soft laughter rippled around the table. Naomi bent down, picked up both pieces of her broken badge, and carefully slipped them into her portfolio instead of throwing them away. Her movements were slow, controlled, almost gentle. She looked toward Richard once more. "Sir," she said quietly, "please do not sign that agreement." Richard paused just long enough to let the room enjoy the moment. "You interrupted my meeting to give legal advice?" More laughter followed. One executive leaned toward another and whispered, "She probably thinks she is saving the company." Naomi ignored them. "I am trying to prevent something that cannot be undone." Richard smiled without warmth. "You are a visitor. Nothing more." He picked up the thick contract resting beside a silver fountain pen. The polished metal reflected the cold ceiling lights across his hand. "This deal has been reviewed by 37 attorneys." Naomi kept her voice steady. "Not by the one person who needed to see it." The room grew noticeably quieter. Richard's expression hardened. "Security." 2 guards stepped forward. Their shoes echoed sharply across the marble as they approached Naomi. She did not resist. She simply kept watching the contract in Richard's hand. The giant presentation screen behind him displayed the company logo beside the words Strategic Acquisition Approval. Investors adjusted their chairs. Camera phones quietly appeared beneath the table. Everyone expected another embarrassing moment. Richard uncapped his pen. "Watch carefully," he said, glancing at Naomi. "This is how real decisions are made." His signature touched the first page. Naomi closed her eyes for the briefest moment. "Please stop." Her voice was barely louder than a whisper, yet somehow it carried across the entire room. Richard finished writing his name anyway. Applause broke out from one side of the table. Naomi lowered her head, not in defeat, but as if listening for something no one else could hear. Then every phone in the boardroom vibrated at exactly the same time. The applause stopped instantly. One investor frowned at his screen. Another slowly stood from his chair. The technician monitoring the presentation looked confused as every display suddenly flickered. Richard turned toward the wall-sized monitor just as the company logo disappeared without warning. The room fell into complete silence. A black screen appeared. White letters slowly faded into view. They were not addressed to the board. They were addressed to one person alone. Naomi Carter. "Thank you for arriving on time." The words remained frozen across the giant screen. Naomi Carter. "Thank you for arriving on time." No one breathed. The low hum of the projector suddenly sounded louder than the people filling the boardroom. Richard Sterling slowly lowered the silver pen from his hand, his signature still drying across the final page. "Who did this?" he demanded. Nobody answered. Every executive stared at the glowing message as cold white light reflected across the polished table and nervous eyes. One technician frantically typed commands into his keyboard. "Sir, the system is not responding." Richard's jaw tightened. "Take the screen offline." "I cannot." His voice cracked. Someone already has administrator control. A ripple of whispers spread across the room. Naomi remained beside the conference table, still holding the torn pieces of her visitor badge inside her portfolio. The security guards who had been ordered to remove her hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances before stepping back instead of forward. Richard noticed immediately. "Why are you standing there?" he snapped. Neither guard moved. The room no longer felt under his control. A soft electronic chime echoed again. Every company tablet lit up with the same notification. Priority archive access authorized. Investors looked at one another in confusion. Several phones quietly began recording. Richard reached for the nearest tablet and read the message twice before his expression hardened. "This is fake." Naomi finally spoke. "No." Her voice remained calm, almost impossibly calm. "It has been waiting for this meeting." Richard laughed once, but there was no confidence left in the sound. "You expect everyone here to believe that?" Naomi looked toward the enormous display instead of him. "No. I expect them to watch." Without warning, the black screen dissolved into grainy security footage recorded years earlier. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon sunlight inside an unfinished conference room. Construction workers moved in the background. Standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows was an older man in a dark suit. Charles Sterling, the company's late founder. A stunned silence filled the room. One investor slowly lowered his glasses. "That recording has never been released." Richard stared at the screen. His breathing became shallow. "Where did this come from?" The video continued without answering him. Charles walked toward the camera carrying a sealed folder. He stopped, looked directly into the lens, and spoke with quiet certainty. "If you are seeing this, someone has ignored the one person I trusted most." Every eye shifted toward Naomi. She did not move. Charles continued. "She will probably arrive wearing no title that impresses you. She may even be treated like she does not belong." Richard's face slowly lost color. "Turn it off," he whispered. Nobody listened. "The people who judge her appearance before her words," Charles said, "will reveal exactly why this protocol exists." A long silence followed. Even the air conditioning seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the moment. Richard looked around the room, hoping someone would dismiss the recording, but every executive was now watching Naomi instead of him. The balance inside the boardroom had shifted without anyone saying a word. Naomi lowered her eyes. There was no satisfaction on her face. Only sadness. "You knew this was coming," Richard said quietly. "I hoped it never would." Before he could answer, the technician suddenly leaned closer to his monitor. His hands began shaking. "Sir," his voice barely carried across the room. "The archive is opening another file." The screen flickered once more. Charles Sterling disappeared. In his place appeared a single digital envelope stamped with one line that made every person in the room freeze. "Open only after Naomi Carter has been publicly humiliated." The digital envelope remained sealed in the center of the giant screen. "Open only after Naomi Carter has been publicly humiliated." Nobody reached for a keyboard. Nobody whispered. The room had become so quiet that the faint vibration of a forgotten phone against the polished conference table sounded like distant thunder. Richard Sterling stared at the message, then slowly turned toward Naomi. For the first time that afternoon, certainty disappeared from his face. "Did you know about this?" he asked. Naomi held his gaze without anger. "No," her answer came quietly. "But I knew your father never trusted coincidence." Richard took one slow step toward her. "Then explain why your name keeps appearing." Naomi glanced at the black screen before answering. "Because this was never about me." Confusion swept across the boardroom. One investor frowned. "Then who is it about?" Naomi looked directly at Richard. "It is about the choices people make when they believe no one important is watching." A chill moved through the room. Richard shook his head. "Enough." His voice grew sharper, louder, as though volume alone could restore control. "This entire performance ends now." He pointed toward security. Escort her out. The guards looked at one another. Neither moved. One finally answered, almost apologetically. Sir, the system has temporarily suspended all executive removal orders. Richard stared at him in disbelief. The system did what? The technician swallowed hard. Someone locked every security command. Before anyone could speak again, the envelope on the screen slowly opened by itself. A single document appeared. Employee Recognition Archive. Richard frowned. What is this? The first page loaded. It showed an old company newsletter from 8 years earlier. The photograph was faded, but unmistakable. Charles Sterling stood smiling beside a much younger Naomi Carter as they accepted an ethics award together. Gasps rippled through the room. Richard stepped closer to the display. No! The next page appeared automatically. Another photograph. Charles sitting across from Naomi inside the very same boardroom while senior attorneys took notes around them. Then another. Naomi shaking hands with members of the original board. Another. Charles writing beside her during late-night strategy sessions. Every new image shattered another assumption. The woman everyone had dismissed as an outsider had once stood at the very center of the company's foundation. Richard's breathing became uneven. Why have I never seen these? The gray-haired general counsel quietly answered from the end of the table. Because they were removed from public archives after Mr. Sterling retired from daily operations. Richard slowly turned. Who authorized that? No one answered. The silence itself became suspicious. Naomi finally broke it. Someone wanted the company to forget who built its ethics. Richard looked back at her. Why did you disappear? She hesitated. The question seemed heavier than all the accusations before it. Because your father asked me to. Several executives blinked in disbelief. That makes no sense, Richard said. He needed someone outside the spotlight, Naomi replied. Someone people would underestimate. The words settled over the room like falling ash. Investors who had mocked her minutes earlier quietly lowered their eyes. Their confidence had become embarrassment. Richard searched Naomi's face, looking for anger, satisfaction, anything that might explain why she had remained silent through every insult. He found neither. Only calm. The technician suddenly leaned toward his monitor again. His eyes widened. Sir, his voice trembled. There is another encrypted file. Richard closed his eyes for one brief moment before opening them again. What now? The technician looked from the screen to Naomi, then back again. It is requesting biometric authorization. Richard reached toward the keyboard. Use mine. The system rejected him instantly. Access denied? The room held its breath. A new line appeared beneath the message. Authorized identity required, Naomi Carter. Place your hand on the scanner, the technician whispered. Every head turned toward Naomi Carter. The glowing biometric panel reflected icy blue light across the polished conference table, while dozens of anxious faces waited for her next move. Richard Sterling stepped between Naomi and the console. No. His voice came fast, sharp, desperate. Nobody touches that system until my attorneys review it. His words echoed through the room, but they no longer carried the certainty they had only minutes earlier. The investors noticed. The executives noticed. Even the security guards remained perfectly still. Naomi looked at Richard with calm eyes. Every second you delay gives whoever built this protocol exactly what they expected. Richard clenched his jaw. You keep speaking as though you understand my father's intentions better than I do. Naomi did not answer immediately. The silence itself became heavier than an argument. I understand his fears, she finally replied. The technician glanced nervously between them. Sir, the encrypted archive is counting down. A small timer appeared in the corner of every display. 9 minutes and 53 seconds. 9 minutes and 52. The soft electronic clicks sounded louder than the conversations that had completely disappeared. Warm air drifted from the server cabinets hidden behind the presentation wall, while the giant screens cast pale reflections across brushed steel trim and expensive watches. Richard stared at the countdown. What happens when it reaches 0? Nobody knew. Nobody answered. Naomi slowly stepped closer to the biometric reader. Her worn leather portfolio rested against her side, the torn visitor badge still tucked inside. Richard blocked her path again. Tell me who you really are. Someone your father trusted. That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters right now. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances. One investor quietly lowered the phone that had been recording. Another executive wiped nervous sweat from his wrist as the room grew warmer despite the cool air flowing from the ceiling vents. Richard's voice hardened again. You expect me to believe my own father hid all of this from me? Naomi looked toward the panoramic windows where storm clouds slowly drifted away from the Manhattan skyline. He did not hide it from you. Richard frowned. Then where was it? She turned back toward him. Exactly where he believed you would only find it after making the same mistake he spent his life trying to teach you not to make. Those words struck harder than any accusation. Richard looked away first. The timer continued falling. 8 minutes. 59 seconds. The technician suddenly leaned toward another monitor. Sir, his breathing quickened. The building network just isolated this floor. A sharp electronic click echoed through the boardroom. Then another. Every glass door automatically locked. Several executives instinctively walked toward the exits, but the access panels glowed red. Nobody could leave. Quiet whispers spread through the room like a rising tide. Is this a lockdown? Who activated it? Call building security. The technician swallowed. External communications are disabled. Richard grabbed his phone. No signal. Every investor checked theirs. Nothing. The only connection left alive was the massive display wall waiting for Naomi's authorization. Richard slowly looked back at her. This is your doing. Naomi shook her head. No. Her voice remained steady. This is your father's final interview. Confusion swept across every face. Interview? One director repeated. Naomi nodded once. He told me that leadership is never tested when everyone agrees with you. She glanced toward the shattered remains of her visitor badge inside the portfolio. It is tested by how you treat the person you believe has nothing to offer. Nobody in the room could meet her eyes anymore. Richard's breathing became shallow. His reflection trembled across the glossy black screen as the timer reached exactly 8 minutes. The technician whispered again, barely able to speak. Sir? There is another message. White letters slowly appeared beneath the countdown. Biometric authorization accepted only after voluntary invitation from current Chief Executive Officer. The room fell into complete silence. Every eye turned toward Richard because for the first time that day, only one sentence could unlock the truth, and it was the same sentence he had refused to say since Naomi walked through the door. Richard Sterling stared at the glowing sentence as though it had stripped away every title he had ever earned. Biometric authorization accepted only after voluntary invitation from current Chief Executive Officer. The timer continued its relentless descent. 7 minutes. 59 seconds. 7 minutes. 58. The room seemed to shrink around him. Warm air drifted from the hidden server racks behind the presentation wall, while the faint vibration of cooling fans echoed beneath the heavy silence. Every investor watched him now instead of the screens. Every phone camera remained raised, recording the moment his authority began slipping away. Richard forced himself to speak. This is blackmail. His voice sounded louder than he intended, but weaker than anyone had ever heard. Naomi Carter remained still beside the scanner, her worn portfolio resting against her leg. No, she answered quietly. It is a choice. Richard laughed once, but the sound broke halfway through. You think you can walk into my company and make demands? Naomi looked at him without blinking. I have not demanded anything. The technician swallowed hard. Sir? The archive cannot be accessed without your spoken authorization. Richard slammed both hands onto the polished conference table. The sharp crack echoed through the boardroom, startling several executives. Override it. The technician shook his head. There is no override. A nervous whisper spread among the investors. One elderly board member slowly removed his glasses. Another quietly loosened his tie. The polished chrome trim along the conference room walls reflected anxious faces that no longer looked confident. The timer dropped below 7 minutes. Richard pointed toward Naomi. She planned this. Silence answered him. He turned toward his executives, expecting agreement. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended him. One woman who had laughed when Naomi's badge was torn now lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. Another executive slowly reached into a wastebasket and removed one half of Naomi's broken visitor badge that had been thrown away earlier. She gently brushed the dust from its surface before placing it on the conference table. Richard watched the gesture in disbelief. The room was changing in front of him. The humiliation had quietly shifted directions. Tell them, Richard demanded, staring at Naomi. Tell everyone who you really are. Naomi's expression remained calm. You already know enough. No. His voice cracked. I know nothing. Another electronic tone interrupted him. The giant screen flickered. Charles Sterling's recorded voice returned without showing his face. Jonathan! The room froze. Richard closed his eyes. My name is Richard, he whispered. The recording continued anyway. If you cannot invite her into this room with respect, you are not ready to lead this company. The mistake struck every person present. Charles had recorded the message years before, believing his own son would inherit under different circumstances. Yet the words somehow landed with even greater force. Richard slowly looked around the room. No one seemed focused on the incorrect name. They were focused on the meaning behind it. His breathing became uneven. The timer reached 6 minutes. 54 seconds. The technician suddenly leaned closer to the monitor, his face draining of color. Sir, his voice trembled. The succession protocol is beginning automatic execution. Every display changed at once. The company organizational chart dissolved into a new document. Executive authority status. Richard Sterling's title remained at the top for only 1 second before a red line slowly appeared beneath it. Pending review. Gasps swept through the boardroom. Investors instinctively stood. The security guards exchanged uncertain glances. Richard felt the room tilting beneath him. Everything he had built, every decision, every ounce of authority, now depended on words he had refused to speak. He looked at Naomi again, searching for anger, triumph, anything that would explain why she had endured every insult without defending herself. He found only quiet patience. Then the technician whispered the sentence that emptied every trace of confidence from Richard's face. Sir, if the countdown reaches 0 without your invitation, the protocol transfers temporary authority to the only person your father pre-approved. Every eye in the boardroom slowly turned toward Naomi Carter. Every eye remained fixed on Naomi Carter. The countdown glowed in the corner of the giant display, falling 1 silent second at a time. 6 minutes. 12 seconds. 6 minutes. 11. Nobody reached for a keyboard anymore. Nobody whispered. The boardroom had become so still that the faint vibration of a forgotten phone against the polished walnut table sounded like a distant heartbeat. Richard Sterling stood frozen beside the biometric scanner. His expensive suit suddenly felt too heavy on his shoulders. The reflection staring back at him from the black display looked less like a billionaire, and more like a man slowly realizing that power could disappear without a single signature. Naomi did not move. She simply watched the timer with calm, steady eyes. Her breathing never changed. That quiet confidence unsettled everyone more than panic ever could. One investor who had openly laughed when her visitor badge was torn now quietly bent down and placed the other half of the broken badge beside the first piece on the conference table. No one told him to do it. It felt instinctive. Another executive carefully slid the reconstructed pieces together, as though repairing something much larger than plastic. Richard noticed every movement. The room that had once reflected his authority was beginning to reflect her dignity instead. "Why are you not saying anything?" Richard asked softly. His voice no longer carried anger, only exhaustion. Naomi looked toward the skyline beyond the towering windows where the storm clouds had begun drifting away, revealing thin ribbons of evening sunlight across the glass towers outside. "Because this was never about proving I was right," she answered. "It was about giving you the chance to choose." Her words settled into the silence like falling snow. Several executives slowly lowered their eyes. One woman quietly wiped away tears before anyone noticed. The technician leaned closer to his monitor. "The protocol has stopped requesting biometric authorization." Richard frowned. "What does it want now?" Nobody answered immediately. The screen faded to black once more. Then a single sentence appeared. "Leadership cannot be inherited. It must be recognized." The letters glowed against the dark display while cool white ceiling lights reflected across polished steel trim and untouched coffee cups. Richard stared at the message for several long seconds. "He wrote that?" he whispered. Naomi nodded once. "He lived that." Another quiet vibration echoed through the room. This time it came from Richard's own phone. He looked down slowly. The caller identification displayed a number he had not seen in years. Charles Sterling Private Archive. His hand trembled before he answered. Silence greeted him. No voice. No recording. Only a soft click. Then an old voicemail automatically began playing through the room's connected speakers. Charles spoke with the calm certainty everyone remembered. "If you ever reach the day when the room trusts someone else more than it trusts you, do not fight for the chair. Ask yourself why." Richard closed his eyes. Around him, no executive moved. No investor looked away. The message ended, leaving only the low hum of the ventilation and the fading warmth from the server equipment behind the walls. Richard slowly opened his eyes again. This time he looked directly at Naomi, not with suspicion, not with resentment, but with a question he had never imagined asking. Did he know this day would happen? Naomi hesitated. For the first time all afternoon, emotion flickered across her face. He hoped it never would. The room grew even quieter. Every person present understood those words carried grief rather than victory. The countdown disappeared without explanation. The technician blinked in confusion. It stopped. Before anyone could react, the giant display illuminated one final time. A sealed folder appeared in the center of the screen, outlined in soft gold instead of red. Across the front, Charles Sterling's handwriting slowly came into focus. For Naomi Carter and my son. Open together. The golden folder remained suspended on the giant screen. For Naomi Carter and my son. Open together. No one reached for it. The silence inside the boardroom felt almost sacred. Warm evening light reflected across the glass walls while the low hum of the servers faded until every slow breath became impossible to ignore. Richard Sterling looked at Naomi instead of the screen. Will you help me? The question barely escaped his lips. It was the first request he had made instead of an order. Naomi studied him for a long moment. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, only the weight of a promise she had carried for years. Only if you are ready to hear everything, she answered. Richard nodded once. I am. The technician activated the shared authorization panel. 2 illuminated handprints appeared beneath the folder. One labeled Richard Sterling. The other labeled Naomi Carter. Every investor leaned forward. The polished chrome trim around the room reflected anxious faces, while several forgotten phones continued recording in complete silence. Naomi placed her hand on the scanner first. A soft green light spread beneath her fingertips. She stepped back. Richard hesitated. His reflection trembled across the glass surface before he slowly pressed his own hand beside hers. The scanners chimed together. Access granted? The folder opened. Instead of contracts or financial records, the first page displayed a single photograph. Charles Sterling stood between a young Richard and a younger Naomi, all three smiling during the dedication ceremony of the company's ethics leadership program. Richard stared in disbelief. "I do not remember this," Naomi answered quietly. "You left before the ceremony ended." Another page appeared. A handwritten letter from Charles filled the screen. "Richard, if you are reading this beside Naomi, then she has kept her promise longer than I deserved. Years ago, I asked her to disappear from public view and quietly protect this company from the one danger money could never defeat: pride." The room fell completely still. Charles continued. "Naomi never worked for me because she needed a paycheck. She worked beside me because she believed character mattered more than titles. One day, people may judge her before they listen to her. If that happens, they will reveal whether this company has truly learned anything." Several executives lowered their heads. The woman who had mocked Naomi during the meeting quietly wiped tears from her eyes. One investor slowly stood, then another, until every person around the conference table rose without anyone asking them to. Richard could not look away from the screen. Charles's final paragraph appeared. "The greatest test of leadership is not whether others recognize your authority. It is whether you recognize the value of someone who has none." Richard's shoulders sank. He looked toward the broken visitor badge that now rested carefully reassembled beside the conference table. His own hand had destroyed it. Everyone in the room knew it. Naomi remained silent. She never reminded anyone what had happened. She did not need to. The truth had become louder than humiliation. The gray-haired chairwoman of the board slowly stepped forward. She looked first at Naomi, then at Richard. "Miss Carter," she said with unmistakable respect, "on behalf of this board, we owe you an apology." No one objected. Several executives nodded quietly. Richard stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "No," he said softly. "I owe her more than that." His voice trembled as he faced the room. "I judged intelligence by appearance. I judged integrity by a visitor badge. I judged character before I listened." Every word seemed to cost him something. Naomi finally met his eyes. "Then today was not a failure?" Richard frowned. "How can you say that?" "Because you finally saw what your father spent years trying to teach." A faint electronic tone interrupted the moment. The technician looked back at the display. His expression changed instantly. "There is one last file." The room froze again. The title slowly faded into view beneath Charles Sterling's signature. "Final appointment. Effective immediately." The document had not been opened yet, but every person inside the boardroom already understood that whatever appeared next would change every life in the room forever. The unopened document rested in the center of the display like a heartbeat the entire room could hear. Final appointment. Effective immediately. Nobody reached for the keyboard. Nobody interrupted the silence. The soft vibration from the building's ventilation drifted through the boardroom while the last glow of evening sunlight reflected across polished steel and the enormous glass windows overlooking Manhattan. Richard Sterling slowly looked away from the screen and toward Naomi Carter. The confidence that had defined him all afternoon was gone. In its place remained only the quiet weight of regret. Naomi stood exactly where she had stood since entering the room. Her torn visitor badge rested on the conference table beside the carefully reconstructed pieces, now fitting together almost perfectly. She never reached for it. She did not need to. Every executive's eyes followed her with a respect that had not existed an hour earlier. The gray-haired chairwoman quietly broke the silence. "Open the file." The technician hesitated only long enough to glance toward Richard. Richard nodded. "Do it." The document slowly unfolded across the giant display. Charles Sterling's signature appeared first. Then the title beneath it: Permanent Guardian of Corporate Ethics. A second line faded into view. Appointed, Naomi Carter. Effective upon verified failure of executive character assessment. The room stopped breathing. One investor quietly removed his glasses. Another lowered the phone that had been recording every moment since the meeting began. Nobody spoke. Charles's final written statement appeared beneath the appointment. Leadership without integrity is only management. If this appointment becomes active, do not congratulate Naomi. Apologize to her. She never sought authority. She accepted responsibility. Richard closed his eyes. His shoulders slowly fell as though years of certainty had finally slipped away. Around the room, the executives who had watched him humiliate Naomi no longer looked toward him for direction. Their attention remained fixed on the woman who had never defended herself with anger. One by one, they quietly stood from their seats. No announcement. No command. Just silent respect. The executive who had first laughed when Naomi warned Richard stepped forward carrying the repaired visitor badge with both hands. "Miss Carter," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I was wrong." Naomi accepted neither the apology nor the badge. She simply smiled gently. "Thank you for saying it." Another executive spoke. "We judged you before we knew you," Naomi answered with the same calm expression. "You judged what you could see." Her words carried no accusation. That made them hurt even more. Richard slowly walked toward the conference table. Every polished step echoed through the silent room. He picked up the torn visitor badge himself and carefully aligned the two pieces with his fingertips. The simple plastic card reflected the fading sunlight like something far more valuable than it had been that morning. "I destroyed this," he whispered. Naomi looked at the badge before meeting his eyes. The badge was never the problem. Richard understood immediately. His breathing caught. The humiliation he had intended for someone else had become a mirror showing him exactly who he had been. The chairwoman quietly addressed the room. "The appointment is valid." No one objected. Every board member nodded. Several investors followed. There was no vote because no one questioned the document anymore. The authority in the room had shifted completely, not through force, but through truth. Naomi looked toward the panoramic windows where the storm had fully passed. Warm amber light washed across the skyline, replacing the cold reflections that had filled the boardroom at the beginning of the meeting. She finally picked up the repaired visitor badge, studied it for a brief moment, then gently placed it beside Charles Sterling's appointment instead of clipping it back onto her jacket. Richard watched the gesture in silence. He realized she was leaving the humiliation behind without pretending it had never happened. The technician suddenly glanced back toward the display. "There is one final message." Everyone turned. Beneath the appointment, a single handwritten sentence slowly appeared in Charles Sterling's familiar script. "Richard, if she chooses to walk away after today, let her. If she chooses to stay, spend the rest of your career proving you deserve the second chance she gave you." No one spoke. Richard looked toward Naomi, but she was already gazing quietly at the city beyond the glass, her expression unreadable as the last light of day settled across the room. The last sentence from Charles Sterling remained glowing on the screen long after the words had been read. Nobody hurried to leave. Nobody reached for another document. The boardroom that had echoed with laughter and humiliation only hours earlier now rested in complete silence. The low hum of the ventilation faded into the background while the final warmth from the presentation screens slowly disappeared. Outside, the storm had fully passed. Golden evening light stretched across the Manhattan skyline and spilled gently through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting across polished steel, quiet faces, and the repaired visitor badge resting beside the appointment letter. Richard Sterling stood motionless, unable to look away from it. For the first time in his career, the smallest object in the room carried more weight than every contract he had ever signed. Naomi Carter calmly closed her worn leather portfolio. Her movements remained unhurried, almost effortless, as though she had never entered the room to win anything. The gray-haired chairwoman stepped forward and quietly moved the executive nameplate that had always occupied the center of the conference table. Without announcing it, she placed Charles Sterling's appointment letter beside it. No applause followed. None was needed. Every executive understood the gesture. Respect had quietly replaced status. Richard slowly picked up the repaired visitor badge with both hands. The edges where it had been torn were still visible. He looked at it for a long moment before turning toward Naomi. "I cannot erase what I did," he said softly. His voice carried no authority now, only honesty. But I can choose who I become after today. Naomi met his eyes without anger. That choice was always yours. The words settled gently over the room. Nobody lowered their gaze because of fear anymore. They lowered it because they recognized themselves inside the lesson they had just witnessed. One by one, the executives quietly removed their company badges and placed them on the conference table beside Naomi's repaired visitor badge. The polished metal clips reflected the warm evening light like small mirrors. No one had planned the gesture. It simply happened. The chairwoman smiled faintly. Today we remembered that titles open doors, she said. Character keeps them open. Richard nodded, then did something no one in the room expected. He stepped away from the head of the conference table and pulled out the chair that had always belonged to him. He did not sit. Instead, he looked toward Naomi. She gently shook her head. That chair was never the goal. Richard slowly pushed it back into place. He finally understood. Leadership was not something another person could hand to him. It was something he would have to earn again. The technician quietly powered down the giant display. The screens faded to black until only the reflections of the people standing together remained. The room no longer looked divided. It looked changed. Naomi picked up the repaired visitor badge one final time. She turned it over in her fingers, then carefully placed it inside her portfolio instead of clipping it onto her jacket. She was not carrying the humiliation with her. She was carrying the lesson. Without another word, she walked toward the glass doors. This time, before she reached them, every executive, every investor, every member of the board instinctively stepped aside. No one had to ask them. Richard opened the door himself and quietly held it for her. Their eyes met for only a second. No speech could have said more. Naomi gave a small nod and walked into the quiet hallway. Her footsteps echoed softly before fading into the distance. Richard remained standing in the doorway, watching until she disappeared beyond the last stretch of warm evening light. He then looked back toward the conference table where the repaired visitor badge had rested only moments before. The empty space beside Charles Sterling's letter seemed brighter than everything else in the room. Outside, the city continued moving beneath a sky finally cleared of clouds. Inside, no one spoke. They simply stood together in the silence, because sometimes the strongest proof that a person has changed is not found in what they say, but in the quiet respect they finally learn to give.